Hello, my name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. Please, sit down and listen to my story. It's one that changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and finding strength when you think you have none left. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, but it feels like a lifetime. Some days it feels like yesterday, and other days it feels like it happened to someone else entirely. I never imagined that the worst day of my life would also become the beginning of the most liberating chapter I'd ever lived. My husband, Robert, and I had been married for 48 wonderful, complicated, beautiful years. We met when I was 19 and he was 21 at a church social in downtown Philadelphia. I was wearing a blue dress with tiny white flowers on it. I remember because he told me years later that's what caught his eye first, how the blue matched my eyes. We'd built what I thought was a beautiful life together. Robert worked as an accountant for a small firm, steady and reliable, just like him. I taught elementary school for 30 years, watching generations of children grow up, some of whom brought their own children to my classroom decades later. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had our small traditions, Sunday morning pancakes, Friday night movies, and Robert's terrible attempts at home improvement projects that I'd have to secretly fix when he wasn't looking. We raised our son Michael in a little colonial house on Maple Street. Oh, how I loved that boy. He had Robert's steady temperament but my adventurous spirit. As a child, he was always bringing home stray animals, broken toys he wanted to fix, and friends who needed an extra place at the dinner table. I used to joke that our house had revolving doors. Michael grew up to be a kind man, a good man. He became a teacher like me, married Jessica when he was 28, and gave us 3 beautiful grandchildren, Tommy, now 21, Sarah, 18, and little Emma, who just turned 15. But let me tell you about that terrible Tuesday morning in March. I'll never forget the smallest details. Robert had gotten up at 6:30, same as always. He made the coffee while I prepared his breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a slice of cantaloupe when it was in season. That morning, he was grumbling about the weather forecast, something about how the meteorologists never got anything right anymore. He was sitting at our kitchen table, the same oak table we'd bought 30 years earlier when Michael started high school and needed space to spread out his homework. Robert had his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, frowning at an article about the local mayor when he suddenly made this small sound, almost like a sigh. I looked up from the dishes I was washing, and he was just gone. His hand was still holding the newspaper, his coffee cup was still steaming, but Robert was no longer there. The paramedics said it was massive and instantaneous. A widowmaker, they called it, though I found that term unnecessarily cruel. The doctor at the hospital, a kind young woman who looked barely older than my grandson, explained that Robert wouldn't have felt any pain. She said it like it should comfort me, and maybe it did, a little. But in that moment, sitting in that sterile waiting room with its fluorescent lights and smell of disinfectant, I felt like my entire world had tilted off its axis. The days that followed were a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and endless streams of people offering condolences that all seemed to blend together. Michael had died in a car accident the year before. A drunk driver ran a red light and took my boy from us in an instant. Losing both my husband and my son within 13 months felt like God was testing just how much one person could endure. The funeral was on a Friday. It rained, of course, because apparently even the weather wanted to match my mood. St. Mary's was packed with people whose faces I recognized but whose names I struggled to remember through my fog of grief. Robert's colleagues, former students of mine, neighbors we'd known for decades. Jessica sat in the front pew with the children, looking elegant in her black suit, her makeup perfect despite what I assumed were tears. I gave a eulogy about Robert's love for crossword puzzles, his terrible singing voice that he insisted on using anyway, and how he never forgot our anniversary, not once in 48 years. I talked about his gentleness with the grandchildren, how he'd spend hours teaching Tommy to throw a baseball and helping Sarah with her science projects. What I didn't say was how lost I felt, how the house already seemed too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that now felt more like ghosts. After the service, people came back to the house. It's a tradition, I suppose, though I'd never understood the logic of it. Why do we feed people after funerals? Why do we fill houses with chatter and laughter when all we want to do is curl up in the quiet and cry? But I went through the motions, accepting hugs and listening to stories about Robert that I'd heard a dozen times before. By 5 o'clock, most people had left. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and still wearing the black dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, something I'd hoped I'd never need. I was sitting in Robert's chair, holding his favorite coffee mug, when I heard a firm knock at the front door. Jessica stood on my porch, and something about her posture made me immediately uneasy. She wasn't crying anymore. Her makeup was fresh, her hair was perfectly styled, and she had a briefcase in her hand that I'd never seen before. Behind her, I could see my grandchildren sitting in her car, staring at their phones, probably wondering why they couldn't come in and say goodbye to Grandma properly. "Margaret, we need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "There are some things you need to know about Robert's will and the house." Followed her, confused. "Jessica, honey, can't this wait? It's been a long day, and I'm just so tired." She cut me off with a wave of her hand. "No, it can't wait. You need to understand your situation." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Robert left everything to Michael. In his will, the house, the savings, everything. And when Michael died last year, everything passed to me as his widow. I stared at her, certain I was misunderstanding. "What are you talking about? This is my home. Robert and I bought this house together in 1992. Both our names are on the deed." Jessica's expression hardened. "We're on the deed. Robert transferred his share to Michael 5 years ago, and Michael's will left everything to me and the children. You have no legal claim to this property anymore." My legs felt weak, and I sank back into Robert's chair. "That's impossible. Robert would have told me about something like that. We didn't keep secrets from each other." "Apparently, you did," Jessica said coldly. "Look, Margaret, I'm not heartless. I understand this is difficult for you, but facts are facts. This house is worth nearly $400,000 now, and I have 3 children to think about, their college funds, their future. I can't afford to be sentimental." She set the papers on the coffee table in front of me. "You have 2 weeks to pack your things and find somewhere else to live. I'm putting the house on the market next month." I picked up the papers with shaking hands, but the legal language might as well have been written in a foreign language. Through my grief and shock, nothing was making sense. "Jessica, please, there has to be some mistake. Where am I supposed to go? This house, it's all I have left of Robert, of Michael. It's where I raised my son, where we celebrated Christmas, mornings, and birthday parties. You can't just—" "I can, and I am," she interrupted. "Look, I'm sorry about Robert. I really am. He was a good man, and I know you loved him. But sentiment doesn't pay college tuition or put food on the table. Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back. This house belongs to Michael's family now, and that's me and the kids." The cruelty in her voice was like a physical blow. This was the woman my son had loved, the mother of my grandchildren, and she was speaking to me like I was a stranger, an inconvenience to be disposed of. After she left, I sat in that chair for hours, staring at those papers until the words blurred together. I kept thinking there had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call. But as the evening wore on and the house grew darker around me, a terrible possibility began to take shape in my mind. What if Jessica was telling the truth? What if Robert really had kept this secret from me? What if my own son had written me out of his will? The first week after Jessica's ultimatum was the darkest period of my life. I barely ate, barely slept, barely functioned at all. I wandered through the house like a ghost, touching things that Robert had touched, sitting in chairs where he'd sat, trying to absorb whatever essence of him might still linger in the fabric. And would dot my neighbor Helen, a sweet woman in her 60s who'd lived next door for 15 years, knocked on my door every day. She'd bring soup or sandwiches, sit with me for a while, and tried to convince me to fight Jessica's claim. But I was too overwhelmed, too heartbroken, too tired to imagine taking on a legal battle. "Margaret, honey, this doesn't sound right," Helen said on the 4th day, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands. "Robert loved you. In all the years Frank and I have lived next door, we never saw a couple more devoted to each other. He wouldn't have left you homeless." I appreciated her faith in Robert, but doubt had taken root in my mind. Maybe he thought Michael would take care of me. Maybe he didn't think about what would happen if Michael died first. We never talked about wills or inheritance. We were both healthy. We thought we had time. "You need to call a lawyer," Helen insisted. At least have someone look at those papers Jessica showed you. Get a second opinion. But I couldn't bring myself to make that call. The thought of admitting to a stranger that my husband might have betrayed me, that my son might have forgotten about me in his final wishes, felt too humiliating to bear. It was on the 7th day, a Wednesday morning, when the sunlight was streaming through the kitchen windows and landing on the exact spot where Robert used to sit with his coffee, that something inside me shifted. I was holding his favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle that he'd refused to let me throw away, when I heard his voice as clearly as if he'd been sitting right next to me. Maggie, he used to call me. You're stronger than you know. Don't let anyone make you forget that. He'd said those words to me dozens of times over the years. When I was struggling with a difficult student, when my mother was dying, when Michael was going through his rebellious teenage phase, Robert always believed in my strength, even when I didn't believe in it myself. I set down the mug and walked to the phone. My nephew David had been a lawyer in Chicago for 15 years, specializing in estate law. He'd offered to help at the funeral, but I'd been too distraught to take him seriously. Now, I dialed his number with hands that were steadier than they'd been in days. Uncle Margaret. David's voice was warm and concerned. How are you holding up? Not well, I admitted. David, I need your help. Something's happened with the house, and I don't know what to do. I explained Jessica's visit, the papers she'd shown me, her ultimatum. David listened without interrupting, but I could hear him typing in the background, probably taking notes. Aunt Margaret, this sounds highly suspicious, he said when I finished. First of all, if Uncle Robert had really transferred his share of the house to Michael 5 years ago, there would have been significant tax implications. He would have needed legal counsel, and knowing Uncle Robert, he would have discussed it with you extensively. Second, even if Michael had inherited the house, most standard wills include provisions for surviving parents. It would be extremely unusual for him to leave you with nothing. Hope flickered in my chest for the first time in a week. What should I do? Don't do anything drastic. Don't pack. Don't move. Don't sign anything Jessica might bring you. I'm going to make some calls, do some research. Can you send me copies of those papers she showed you? I faxed the documents to David's office that afternoon, and he called me back within 2 hours. The anger in his voice was unmistakable. Aunt Margaret, those documents are forgeries. Badly done forgeries, actually. The supposed will is dated last year, but it's notarized by someone whose license expired 3 years ago. The property transfer document has Michael's signature, but it's clearly traced from something else, probably his signature on the life insurance papers after he died. The relief I felt was so overwhelming that I had to sit down. So the house is still mine. Let me confirm everything with Uncle Robert's actual attorney, but based on what I'm seeing, yes, Jessica has been lying to you, hoping you'd be too grief-stricken to investigate. It's fraud, Aunt Margaret, criminal fraud. The next morning, David called with confirmation from Robert's lawyer. The real will left the house to both Michael and me as joint owners, with the survivor inheriting the other's share. Since Michael had died before Robert, I was the sole owner of the property. There had never been any transfer to Michael, and Michael's actual will, which Jessica had never mentioned, left his modest savings to his children but made no mention of any property he didn't actually own. When I called Jessica to confront her with the truth, her response was everything I expected and worse. You can't prove anything, she said, her voice cold and calculated. And even if you could, do you really want to put your grandchildren through the scandal of their mother being arrested? Do you want them to know that their grandmother destroyed their family over a house? The manipulation was breathtaking. She was threatening to turn my grandchildren against me, to make me the villain in a story where she was the criminal. But something had changed in me during those dark days of doubt and despair. I'd found Robert's voice again, reminding me of my own strength. Jessica, I said calmly, you're right that I don't want to hurt the children, but I also won't be bullied or threatened. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop claiming any right to this house immediately. You're going to apologize for lying to me during the worst week of my life. And in return, I won't press charges for fraud and forgery. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And if I don't agree, then David will file criminal charges, and you can explain to Tommy, Sarah, and Emma why their mother is in jail. She agreed, though not graciously. But here's the surprising thing. As the days passed and the immediate crisis resolved, I realized something important. I didn't want to stay in that house anymore. Oh, I could have. It was legally mine, and no one could force me out. But during those 7 days of thinking I'd lost everything, I'd also realized how much of my life had become about maintaining the past rather than living in the present. Every room in that house held memories that were both beautiful and painful. Robert's workshop in the basement, still smelling faintly of wood glue and coffee. Michael's bedroom, which I'd kept exactly as he'd left it when he moved out 15 years earlier. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays and argued about what to watch on television. I loved those memories, but I'd been living in them instead of making new ones. At 72, I still had life to live, adventures to have, people to meet. That house had become a museum of my past, and I was ready to step into my future. I decided to sell the house, but not to spite Jessica or to prove a point. I sold it because I wanted to. I split the proceeds with my grandchildren, setting up college funds for each of them. They deserved something from their father's legacy, even if their mother had tried to steal mine. With my portion of the money, I bought a small cottage on the shores of Lake Winnebago, about 2 hours north of the city. Robert and I had vacationed there for 20 years, renting the same little cabin every summer. When I saw that a cottage just down the beach was for sale, it felt like a sign. The cottage was small, just 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen that opened onto a living room with windows facing the water. It needed work, but it was solid and clean and filled with light. Best of all, it was mine, chosen by me, for me. For the first time in my adult life, I was making a decision based entirely on what I wanted, not on what others needed or expected. Moving day was both heartbreaking and liberating. I kept Robert's coffee mug, his favorite sweater, and a handful of other items that held special meaning. But I left behind decades of accumulated possessions that had been weighing me down without my realizing it. Helen and Frank helped me pack, and Helen cried harder than I did when the moving truck pulled away. "You call us every week," she demanded, hugging me tight. "And if that which Jessica gives you any more trouble, you call David immediately." The first month in the cottage was an adjustment. The silence was different from the city, filled with water lapping against the shore, wind through the pine trees, and the occasional call of a loon. Some nights, I felt lonely in a way I'd never experienced before. But gradually, the peace of the place began to work its magic on my wounded spirit. I started walking the beach every morning, something I'd never had time for in the city. I began painting again, setting up an easel on the screened porch where I could capture the changing moods of the lake. I'd been good at art as a young woman, but marriage and motherhood and career had gradually pushed it aside. Now, with time and space and motivation, I discovered that I still had the eye and the passion for it. The local library had a book club that met every Thursday evening, and after weeks of driving past their meetings, I finally worked up the courage to join. The group was a mix of retirees, working professionals, and a few college students from the nearby university. I was nervous at first, worried that I'd been out of the world of intellectual discussion for too long, but I found that years of teaching had given me skills I'd forgotten I possessed. "You ask really thoughtful questions," said Martha, a retired professor who became one of my closest friends at the lake. "Have you considered that teaching was just practice for a second career?" I laughed, but her words stuck with me. I'd been thinking of this phase of my life as an ending, but maybe it was actually a beginning. 3 months after moving to the cottage, I met Walter. He was 76, a widower who'd been living on the lake for 5 years. I'd seen him fishing from the dock in front of his house, always at sunrise, always with a cup of coffee and a thermos of what I later learned was terrible homemade soup. Our first conversation happened when his fishing line got tangled in some branches that had washed up on my beach. I helped him untangle it, and he offered to teach me to fish as a thank you. I'd never had any interest in fishing before, but something about the quiet concentration of it appealed to me. Walter was nothing like Robert. Where Robert had been methodical and predictable, Walter was spontaneous and full of stories. He'd been a traveling salesman for 30 years, and he knew funny anecdotes about every small town in the Midwest. He made me laugh in ways I'd forgotten were possible. "You know what I like about you, Margaret," he said one morning, as we sat on his dock watching our lines. "You listen like you mean it. Most people are just waiting for their turn to talk." Walter never tried to replace Robert in my heart, and I never wanted him to. What we had was different. a friendship based on this new version of myself, the woman I was becoming rather than the woman I'd been. He helped me remember that my heart was big enough for multiple kinds of love, and that honoring Robert's memory didn't mean closing myself off to new connections. 6 months after Jessica's cruel ultimatum, I received a letter that changed everything. Again, it was from Tommy, my oldest grandson, who had just turned 18 and was preparing for his first year of college. "Dear Grandma," he wrote, "I know Mom said you didn't want to see us anymore after Grandpa died, but I can't believe that's true. I found your address through Uncle David, and I hope it's okay that I'm writing to you. I miss you so much. We all do. Emma still cries sometimes when she talks about you. Could I maybe come visit you this summer? I have a job lined up for after graduation, but I'll have a few weeks free in July." I had to read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Jessica had told my grandchildren that I didn't want to see them anymore. She'd used my grief and absence to rewrite the story of our relationship, making herself the victim and me the villain who had abandoned my family. I called Tommy immediately, and the joy in his voice when he heard mine was like medicine for my soul. "Grandma, I knew Mom was lying. I told Emma and Sarah that you would never just disappear from our lives, but Mom kept saying you needed space to grieve and that we shouldn't bother you." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I would never, ever choose to be away from you children. You are the lights of my life. Your mother and I had some disagreements after Grandpa died, but none of it had anything to do with you kids." Tommy visited in July, and it was the most healing week I'd had since Robert's death. He loved the cottage, spent hours fishing with Walter, and helped me finish painting the kitchen. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch talking about his plans for college, his memories of his father, and his frustrations with his mother's increasingly controlling behavior. "She's changed a lot since Dad died," he told me. "She's always angry about something, always worried about money, even though Dad had good life insurance. She won't let us talk about him very much because she says it makes her too sad, but Emma needs to talk about him. She's only 15, Grandma. She needs to process losing her dad." Through Tommy, I learned that Sarah was struggling in school, acting out in ways that were clearly grief-related, but that Jessica was treating as discipline problems. Emma had become withdrawn and anxious, asking repeatedly why Grandma didn't love them anymore. Hearing about their pain was almost unbearable, but it also clarified what I needed to do. I wrote to Jessica, not as the broken woman she'd tried to intimidate, but as the grandmother who would fight for her grandchildren's well-being. "Jessica," I wrote, "I know things between us have been difficult, but these children need their grandmother. They need to maintain their connection to their father's family, and they need to know that they are loved unconditionally. I'm not asking you to like me or to pretend that our relationship is comfortable. I'm asking you to put your children's needs first." I proposed a schedule. The children could visit me for 2 weeks each summer, plus alternating holidays. I would never speak negatively about their mother in their presence, and I would respect her rules and boundaries as their parent. In return, she would stop telling them that I didn't want to see them. To my surprise, she agreed. I think she was relieved, actually. Raising 3 grieving children while dealing with her own complicated feelings about Michael's death had been overwhelming. Having me back in their lives gave her support she'd been too proud to ask for. That first Christmas together was magical. Sarah helped me bake Robert's famous chocolate chip cookies, using the recipe I'd written on an index card 40 years earlier. Emma opened up about missing her father, and we looked through photo albums together, sharing stories and memories. Tommy showed me how to use the internet to research local art classes, something I'd been wanting to do but hadn't known how to start. The cottage became their refuge, a place where they could grieve openly, ask questions about their father and grandfather, and just be children without the weight of their mother's anxiety and control. I became not just their grandmother again, but a bridge to the parts of their family history that Jessica found too painful to discuss. 2 years later, Sarah chose to spend her senior year of high school living with me. With Jessica's reluctant permission, Sarah had been struggling with depression and anxiety, and the peaceful environment of the lake, combined with distance from her mother's stress, proved to be exactly what she needed. She graduated with honors and was accepted to 3 colleges, including her first choice. Emma followed a similar path, coming to live with me for her junior and senior years. She discovered a love of photography, spending hours documenting the changing seasons around the lake. Some of her pictures now hang in my living room. Beautiful captures of light and water and sky that remind me daily of the artistic eye she inherited from our family. Walter became like a grandfather to all three children, teaching them to fish and telling them stories about their father. When he was young, Walter had known Michael through the lake community. The children brought energy and laughter back into my life, but they also gave me purpose beyond my own healing. Now, 3 years after that terrible day when Jessica stood on my porch and tried to take away everything I thought mattered, I can honestly say I'm grateful for the journey she forced me to take. Not grateful for her cruelty or her lies, but grateful for the strength I discovered when everything familiar was stripped away. I wake up each morning in my cottage by the lake, and the first thing I see is sunlight dancing on water. I make my coffee in a new mug, one I chose myself, and I sit on my porch planning a day that belongs entirely to me. Some days I paint, some days I read, some days I just walk the beach and feel grateful to be alive and healthy and free. My art has improved so much that I've started selling pieces at the local farmers market. Last month, a gallery in town asked if I'd be interested in a small show next spring. At 75, I'm having my first art exhibition, something I never dreamed possible when I was a young woman with paints and ambitions but no time to pursue them. Walter and I have become inseparable friends, though we maintain our separate homes and independence. We fish together most mornings, shared dinner several times a week, and have traveled together to art museums and jazz festivals throughout the Midwest. He's taught me that companionship in later life can be even more meaningful than romance because it's based purely on choice and compatibility rather than passion and need. My grandchildren visit regularly, bringing friends sometimes, filling the cottage with the energy and chaos of young people figuring out their lives. Tommy graduated college last year and has a good job in marketing. Sarah is studying environmental science and talks about working in conservation. Emma is a senior in high school now, planning to study photography and journalism in college. Jessica and I have reached a détente that's more functional than friendly, but it works for the children's sake. She's softened somewhat over the years, I think partly because she's begun dating someone new and partly because she's realized that fighting with me only hurt her kids. We're never going to be close, but we can be civil, and that's enough. Looking back now, I can see that the woman who answered that door in her funeral dress 3 years ago was already grieving more than just Robert's death. She was grieving the end of a life that had been defined entirely by other people's needs and expectations. Robert's death and Jessica's cruelty forced me to confront who I was when I wasn't someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's teacher. What I discovered surprised me. I was still Margaret, but I was a Margaret who had been buried under decades of service and sacrifice. I was an artist, an adventurer, a woman capable of making bold decisions and starting over at 72. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient than I'd given myself credit for, and more deserving of happiness than I'd believed. Robert always said I was stronger than I knew. It just took losing everything I thought mattered to discover he was right. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, and sometimes the people who try to break us end up setting us free. Jessica stood on my porch that day and told me to grieve, pack my bags, and never come back. I did grieve deeply and thoroughly and with all the pain that real love leaves behind. I did pack my bags, but I packed them for a journey toward a life I chose rather than one that was chosen for me, and I never came back to the woman I used to be, the woman who thought her value was measured by how much of herself she gave away. That's my story, and I wanted to share it because I know there are others out there who might be facing their own dark moments, their own Jessica standing at the door with cruel words and impossible demands. I want them to know that strength can come from the most unexpected places, and that it's never too late to write a new chapter, whether you're 72 or 52 or even 32. If you're listening to this and feeling lost or forgotten or taken for granted, please remember that you are more resilient than you know. Your life is not over when one chapter ends. Your worth is not determined by how others treat you, and your story is not finished being written. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope something in it speaks to your heart and reminds you that you're stronger than you know too. And if you're ever driving through Wisconsin and see a cottage by a lake with an old woman painting on the porch, stop by. I'll make you coffee, and we can watch the sun set over the water together.